Coach Vance Newgard here, Senior International Olympic Weightlifting Coach and Professor of Sport and Exercise Science. So in this video, I am going to go over post-activation potentiation, or PAP. So not a very marketable term, but it is beneficial for strength training. It has been used for a very long time, both in training and competition. And essentially what it is you do an exercise or an intensity level to increase the electrical activity within the neuromuscular system, which essentially, I don't want to say trick the body, but it encourages the body to essentially increase the amount of force or force potential in the next set or in the next activity, right? So in athletics, one of the limitations is always the rate of force. So not just the total amount of force you can actually potentially provide, but the rate. So for example, in strength training, the rate of force that you can apply is very important for the squat, for example. Why? Because essentially, where do people get stuck in the squat? Do they get stuck at the top? No, they get stuck towards the middle, right? Because of the force curve, right? So the rate at which you can apply force, getting to essentially peak force earlier allows you to get over the hardest part of that force curve. If you're very slow at getting that force up, you might be able to produce a lot of force over a long period of time. It doesn't matter if you can't get enough force to match the highest force curve, right? So how does this actually work? Well, we figured it out. Mr. kind of research nerd took a group of athletes and whatnot, and one group is going to jump and then do some squats, and another group is just going to do squats or some other exercise, right? And the group that jumps then goes and does their squats. What do? They hook that bar up to a force plate or a power meter, and what happens? They lift with more force and lift with more power, and then they hook them up to EMG, and they can see the electrical activity is higher in the group that jumps first. And you see this all the time. Watch a sprint event. What do some of the sprinters do? They do a couple jumps, one or two jumps, then they get called, get in the starting blocks, and they sprint. Why? So they can have greater force initially out of the blocks. So it's, from a practical sense, it's not the easiest thing to do with strength training. You can, of course, alternate jumping and squatting and that sort of thing, which is a good method, but we are going to go over how to use actual load to encourage post-activation potentiation, with the goal being that if you use a heavier load in one set, then you should be able to do lighter loads for more repetitions, or a higher intensity, or a higher force output, or hopefully all of the above. So I've kind of written down 3 different methods that I use regularly. And something to keep in mind is this is more fatiguing than traditional training. So it's more fatiguing than doing 75% for 3 sets of 5, then 80% for 3 sets of 5, because you're doing essentially a combination of higher load and higher volume. So typically this should be done closer to the end of that training cycle, the strength phase, when you're building up to personal records, for example, is when I typically use it. So here's one method. So you can keep it pretty simple, and this is just the hill method, except for you're only going down the hill. So you start with your heavier weight. So here I have 83% for a set of 5. So for example, around 85, 86% is probably the best for 5 you could do on any given day. So you start at 83%, do a set of 5, and then hopefully you can get more sets of 5 after, or with a higher power output, force output, dropping it down 5%. And then week 2, what? You add 3%, now you're getting closer to failure, if not failure, and then you drop it down. Hopefully I can do 82% for 5 sets of 5, or normally maybe I can only do 80% for 5 sets of 5. And then finally, 88% for 5. Maybe that's a personal record. Then you drop it down to 84% for 5 sets of 5, which would probably be a personal record in terms of how much tolerance you have as well. And here's a 3-week period, but of course, you could just do it until it runs its course, essentially until the athlete is unable to complete the training. So that's probably the simplest method. Another fairly simple method is to do one single, not to failure, so it's not necessarily a max out, but it is a high loading. And you can go 90% for one. You start out just warming up to 90%. All right, so you will probably do a couple others that I didn't count here. I didn't want to write out 85% or 88% or whatever it was. And then drop down and do some volume, like 5 sets of 5 at 80%. Next week, 93% for one, 83% for 5 sets of 5. Following week, 96% for one, 85% for 5 sets of 5. Extremely taxing. Right? And you can do it until you see personal records on the 1 repetition max, if that is your goal, or if you're just trying to get muscle hypertrophy and that sort of thing. This is a little bit more complicated, but you can alternate your high loads with your volume, right? So you can do 90% for one. Call this kind of the 6-1 method. So it's very difficult to do, of course, high loads for 6 repetitions, right? Very challenging. So the goal would be to get more for 6 than you can use 5s, 4s, that sort of thing, but the goal is to get higher load for 6 than you normally would be able to do, just warming up to sets of 6. So you do 90% for one, something like 83% for 6, 90% for one, 84% for 6, 90% for one, 86% for 6. So this would be, these last 3 would be your most challenging set. So you probably want to keep something similar the next week, but these percentages keep going up, and you can make small increases in your load here as well. So if I want to next week have a progressive overload, I of course could do 91% or 92%, and this could be 84%. Or you can just keep it 90% and go up a percent each week. You're building up your tolerance. You're building muscle hypertrophy, so this is a good way to do it. And you're either maintaining your maximal strength or you are increasing it as well. Just keep in mind that you should have a period where you are building up to this. It's not like, oh, I haven't been squatting, I haven't been training hard, so I'm just going to get my squat up by going really heavy and with a high volume. So not a good idea. So make sure you have a period building up to this, that you're in good shape. So if I was going to put this into a training plan, 12-week cycle, this might be like 8 through 12, something like that. Or it might be 6 through 9, and then we have a period of sport-specific training instead. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and share so that I can continue to bring you more free sports science information.